Hey all, I apologize for all the technical difficulties that I'm experiencing tonight, which is so weird, but it did give a couple of people the opportunity to pop into our chat tonight, which I'm excited to see. But let's get to it. The wonderful guest that we have on tonight, Salicrow, she is a natural psychic medium who weaves the traditions of her Irish traveler and Blackfoot heritage with modern magical techniques. For more than 30 years, she has worked as a spirit channel, seer, and intuitive healer, offering readings and teachings and workshops throughout the United States and internationally. The author of The Path of Elemental Witchcraft, and now the new book that we're going to be talking about tonight, Spirit Speaker, A Medium's Guide to Death and Dying. She lives in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and you can find her at www.salicrow.com. And I will have all of her information, including the links to purchase these books, in the comments below. But let's get to it before this computer acts crazy again. Hey, you.
There. Hi, how are you?
Oh, man, thanks for being so patient with me. And most importantly, thank you for coming on my show. It's an honor. It really is.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So both of your books are phenomenal. Okay, you're an amazing writer, but I feel like this one in particular, your newest one, is so needed. And I kind of want to jump right into it. What was the inspiration of this book? Because there were some, stories that you had in here and some things that, made me sad, or like the little anecdotes that you had. So what was the inspiration behind this story and behind this book?
Well, I have been a practicing psychic for over 30 years and have done spirit communication for the public for 20. And for this book was I wanted to give something to everybody. So this started with the questions that I have been most asked by my clients, things that they wanted to know about what happens when we die, from a spiritual perspective of what happens to our spirit, what the spirit goes through, what happens to people when they're sitting with somebody who's dying. And it also does touch base on things that are great primers for people who are trying to develop spirit communication on their own.
So it really covers all the bases in terms of if you're interested in being a psychic medium, if you're interested in being a death doula, if you're interested in, learning how to be a much more receptive and caring and compassionate person when you're with someone who's dying, the aftercare of death.
Right.
There's so much to it. So I guess the first question I'm going to ask is, what is the spiritual explanation as to what happens to us after we die?
Well, so first of all, I'd like to say that this book touches base on all of those things. It's like a very short book. It's only 100 pages.
It is.
And that was done on purpose as well, to make it so that it was affordable to everybody, so people didn't feel overwhelmed by it. And in short, there's a few things that happen when we die that are really notable. One is that the volume of our emotions gets turned down. So if we think about our emotions on a volume dial of 0 to 10, like a stereo, most people go through life with their emotions set at about a 3 or a 4. And if we are experiencing anxiety, depression, mental illness, it's going to be closer to an 8 or a 9. So when we die, that emotional dial gets turned down to about a 2, which allows us to analytically review our life. And we all review our life. So the things that we've done, the things that have happened to us, we go through a process of review. And we also get to see things from multiple perspectives. So again, like if we're watching television or a movie and somebody is hurt by somebody else, we see the background story of what's really happening. Okay? In life, we don't always get the background story when someone hurts us. We don't get to see what was happening on the other side of the door or in their mind or what led them to that. And so there is a lot of clarity that comes with death.
On the part of the spirit.
On the part of the spirit.
So is there ever a situation where there is not clarity after death? Does the way in which someone die, like if it's traumatic or if it's suicide, like do any of those things kind of impact the review process and what the emotional stuff you go through as a
They
spirit?
certainly do, but really, for the most part, what they do is it takes longer because
Gotcha.
when you have a lot of trauma, whether it was again trauma that you caused or trauma that you were the victim of, it is still going to need to be looked at.
Yeah.
And when somebody dies from a violent situation, excuse me, such as, suicide or murder or a traumatic accident, there may be a need for more time in review because there's a lot more emotions that happen in those situations and a lot more damage that is done to not just the person who has passed, but to the people who are affected by that death.
Yeah. Wow. And so, yeah, because there's so many instances in which, people will come to psychic mediums because there's so much controversy around someone's death,
Yeah.
so much confusion, and they just
Hmm.
need clarity in terms of like what happened and if they're even
Yeah.
okay. Have you ever had to, not say that they're not okay, but have you ever had to do, basically, is there ever a situation where a spirit is stuck here? Like, is there a difference between the spirit of the people of loved ones that you've talked about versus like a ghost, someone who's like stuck
Yes, there
here?
is a difference.
Okay.
Difference is what you said, is that they're stuck. Um, so a spirit knows they're dead. A ghost does not necessarily know they're dead, and they will repeat. It's actually pretty complicated because you can also have things that are more like a kind of like a ripple in time. So, like, for example, a battlefield, those spirits aren't stuck there for like eternity. What it is that the land experienced so much trauma.
It's like an
And
imprint.
yes, kind of like if
Yeah.
you have like a double exposure on a picture. So something was there before. That doesn't happen as much with digital photography. But in those cases, it's more like a soft spot in time, and that the moment it has left an imprint, like you said. Um, Ghosts have usually had some kind of trauma, or they have a lot of things that they were not ready to face in their death. So, people who have either done really bad things or people who've experienced a trauma that was too difficult for them to process.
Mm.
But for the
So it's almost
most
like they're
part,
refusing to review.
yes. And
Mm.
there's also spirits that can be kind of like attached to an earthly place. That doesn't mean
Right.
they're stuck there. It means maybe they just really loved being there. So even in the spirit world, they revisit that spot a lot. So when we have like the old lady who's still in our house, it may not be that she is stuck there. It might be that she chooses to revisit there because it's a place that she loved. I did experience once a soul that was the soul of a man who had been handicapped in life, mentally handicapped. And when I got called into the house, his mother had recently been moved to a nursing home and the house had gone up for sale. And the people living in it were experiencing all sorts of spirit activity, including things like they'd put up wallpaper and it'd be torn down. They'd feel somebody sitting in bed, they'd hear pacing. Um, and when I went into that house, the first thing I asked them, was like, was anything left behind? And they said no. But when I went to the basement, I immediately saw this suitcase and I was like, well, what about that? And they're like, well, no, that's not ours. So this suitcase happened to be filled with information about this woman's life, things that she had saved.
Mm.
And it turned out that the spirit that was in the house was the one of her handicapped son. Now, this, it was a time period where somebody who was mentally handicapped might be kept at home so that they don't get made fun of, or for their kind of their own protection. And that was the case in this man's life.
Right.
So when his mom was moved to the nursing home, he didn't know what to do, but
Oh,
he was going to
yeah.
go as soon as she died and could come get him. And the family ended up, we did negotiation. The family ended up, being like, basically, don't rip down the wallpaper and, things like that. And they, a few years later, when the woman did die, he moved on, his spirit moved on. So he
The
was like,
activity stopped when she died.
right, he was pretty much temporarily stuck.
Oh, poor baby. So it's interesting that you brought that particular example up, because I'm a psychic medium as well, but I specialize in disabled people with
Oh,
disabilities and the
interesting. Yep.
spirits of those kinds of people, and some of the most heart-wrenching stories.
Yeah.
Some of the most
Yeah.
heart-wrenching stories.
You can do a lot to give them peace,
Yeah.
though. It's more like, just because they're also are able to perceive spirit. But interestingly enough, I remember that this was early on in my work with spirit publicly, and I am a Reiki master in multiple schools of Reiki. So I put symbols on myself before I went to the house, because I was like, I don't know what I'm getting into.
Right.
And when I went upstairs into the room he was in, he went and hid in the closet. And so I had to sit in the room for quite some time before he would come out, because it was more like he definitely did not know he was dead, and he didn't understand what he was seeing around me. So it was really a different experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. That was beautiful. What about, have you ever gotten, you know, have you ever had to answer the question? And mind you guys, a lot of these questions and stuff will be in the book, and so much more. So like right now I'm kind of going off script because this is such a fun subject. So I'm just, at you as a psychic medium, you with your experience, I'm just going to ask you about you, and then every once in a while we're going to say, hey, don't forget about this.
Okay.
But in your practice, have you ever had to explain um dreams, or someone dreaming about their deceased? Oops, I think we
Mhm.
lost you. Did you still there?
I'm still
um
there.
okay, have you ever had to explain to someone uh what it was about, regarding dreaming about your loved ones who
Mm,
passed? Like, what does that
yeah.
mean?
Well, most of the time, if we're having a dream about somebody that's passed, it is a visitation. And we can tell like the difference by how we feel in the morning. When we
Okay.
wake up, if we have a dream about our mother or our husband or our friend, and we feel like that they were near us, then that was a visitation. You know, there can be times when you might dream about someone who's dead, and it really is just that you're processing through things in a different way. But 90% of the time it's going to be a visitation, and if you feel that way, like you feel it, then it is. One of my things that I try to constantly remind people is to take the words maybe, kind of, and think so out of your vocabulary when you are talking about spirit contact.
Mm, okay, I will try that.
You'll find that you're having a lot more contact than you think you are, because people, they have a lot of, um, when we say, oh my God, I think I just saw my grandmother. Well, I always tell people, it's like, really? You just think you did, or you saw your grandmother? So saying it, I saw my grandmother, when I ask people, okay, it's like, so what do you think? And they're like, I saw my grandmother. Because when we
Mm,
say it in the affirmative, we feel it in our body. We know, like, oh, that was. Plus, what would make you randomly, spontaneously just, decide that you were going to imagine somebody you loved that was dead out of the corner of your eye? Doesn't that seem a little more unlikely than you actually experienced a spirit?
right, right. And I'm pretty sure it must be tough too, dealing with families who've lost someone, because there is a desperate need sometimes to contact, so much so that it borderlines psychological with regards to that grieving process, and maybe more intervention needs to be had than just psychic mediumship. But in the case of just wanting that desperate need to see their family, what do you advise people after having lost someone? Like, is there a time period that they should wait? Is there something specific they should do or not do during the time that the
I
spirit is
don't really
reviewing?
think that there is a time period. I think it's individual. Um, I have actually more than once had spirit contact with somebody within a week of their passing that, I have had people come to me, in the morning, the day of a person's funeral, that they were going to come see me first because they wanted to make sure if there was anything that their loved one needed, that they wanted to be able to have that. Um, I went to a woman's house once who had, I used to do home seances for years. This was about 10, 12 years ago. And I went to a person's house who had a scheduled seance to communicate with her nephew who had passed. And when I got into her house, I was like, I was I didn't even know it was really about the nephew, but that's why she had scheduled it. And I knew when I got opened up for communication that her husband was there. And I was like, "You've lost your husband." And I could see him like falling down the stair, kind of falling down the stairs. He had a heart attack. And I knew that they only lived like 5 minutes from the hospital, and it still wasn't quick enough.
Wow.
Um, but then I was like, he just recently died. He had only been dead for a few days, and she had spent the entire morning telling him he better show up.
Wow.
Like basically because she didn't cancel the appointment she had. She just was like, "No, I'm going to keep this." And so I wrote about this in my book. I took part in one of my friends, Breja, was the third person in the state of Vermont to use the Death with Dignity Act.
Yes.
And she was communicating with me within 10 minutes, telling me that I needed to get tea and coffee on and snacks out for the people who would be coming. So now he's super fast. If it's been a really traumatic death, again, I have communicated with spirits within weeks of their passing. A lot of it depends on what the person can mentally handle, you know, more the living, because what happens when a spirit comes in contact with a medium is the volume gets turned back up again because the medium makes it more like real life for them. So one of my little tricks that I do in those cases, if it's going to be too much like emotional bombardment, is I ask my spirit guide that I work with a spirit guide that I refer to as my doorman. I owned a bar when I was younger, so everybody knows the doorman's job. You can come in, you need to stay there, I'll ask for you, or you need to go. So I will work with my doorman sometimes and ask them to kind of like pass the message in between us so that instead of the spirit coming in contact with me, that's going to turn the volume of their emotions up, the spirit comes in contact with my doorman, and my doorman tells me. And I always tell people that. I will say, like, look, I'm not talking directly to your loved one at this time. I am talking to them through my guide because this is too emotional for them.
Gotcha. And you do that mostly with the traumatic ones. Otherwise, you would
Yeah. Otherwise, even with real traumatic ones, most of the time I don't need to do that. That's a very rare thing. But there are some times when the emotions are just so heavy that there needs to be a little bit of a buffer.
And how have you been able to help families during the dying process? Because it it's not an easy thing. It really isn't. And like I actually remember being a young girl, and witnessing grandparents pass and elderly people pass. And some of the things that you'll notice that are pretty consistent is like they'll see loved ones who had already
Yes.
passed, and it's really consistent across the board.
Yep.
They start calling for them, or they start talking to them as if they're in the room right now, a whole thing. So did you experience that, or was that something that the families that you had to help experienced?
Yeah. Actually, I get it a lot in. I do more work with people after death.
Okay.
I have done work for sure, probably, a dozen or more times been involved in somebody's passing, including, doing mouth to mouth resuscitation on somebody in the process of their passing. But even when I'm doing spirit communication, it's not uncommon for a spirit to come through and, I'll say to the people, the living people, I'll be like, oh, your mother is in the nursing home. And I say, and she is in the gray. And to me, the gray is a word that I use to describe when a person is in the dying process and can't get better, and they usually have about a year and a half to live tops when they're being discussed as being in the gray. And for spirit, what that means is they start to show up more in the spirit world. Just like when a person's going to be born, their pregnancy gives us signs they are coming. The gray is a sign to the dead that they're living is coming. Okay. And the dead spirit will often tell me, okay, mom's in the nursing home. And I'll say, oh, so she's been visiting with your father. The father's the dead person I'm talking to. And they're like, oh my God, she's talking about him all the time. And I'm like, no, she's really visiting with him. Like he's there.
Right.
And I love telling stories. So I want to share a quick story about this that
Yes.
is in the book, actually. Um, I was doing a large gallery at a women's retreat, and then I would be teaching there all weekend. And during the gallery, I called a woman up on stage and I started talking to her about her mother in law who'd passed, and, saying things like about her husband, the woman's father in law, who was in the gray and would be passing soon. And one of the things that the wife talked about was how they loved dancing and they'd be dancing together soon. So the next day, the woman came and found me at the retreat where I was teaching a class to tell me that her husband had called and he and his siblings were all at the nursing home because their father was getting ready to pass. So it was like, boom, it was happening. And so I thought that was cool. That right there, I was like, wow, that was really awesome. The next year, I did the same retreat, and the granddaughter was there. And she came up to me afterwards to tell me that not only had her grandfather passed, but that moments before he did, he put his arms out in front of him, and he started moving his arms and his legs like he was dancing. And so the family had gotten to hear the recording of the spirit communication and knew that that meant that their mom had come to get him. So
Oh my
there's
goodness.
some really cool things that happen with that lead up to death. And people who get into, decide to become death doulas will often find themselves having more experiences with spirit as well because they are in that, vibration of death regularly.
Yes. Have you encountered a spirit of death or a spirit that helps with that transition? Have like you ever met a spirit like that in your time?
No, what I usually find though is that right before somebody dies, because I've been around people like doing healing work on them or whatever in the lead up to their death, is that I can tell by the number of spirits that start gathering around them. So early in the process, a person might have, their spouse showing up or their mom or dad or something like that. And the closer you get to death, the fuller the room gets. But
Wow.
myself personally, I have not experienced a spirit that I would say was death itself.
So what about a gray space on the other side for
Mhm.
spirits? So like there is there a heaven hell? Is there a purgatory? Is so where does that review actually happen?
I think that most people would call it the bardo or purgatory. In my own experience, I've never met anybody who's been to heaven, and I've never met anybody who's been to hell. Now, that does not mean that I do not believe those places exist. What I think is that we have a lot more lifetimes to work through before we get to that passage. Like, I really believe in reincarnation. And in my experience, spirits gather on the other side. They kind of like pool together until enough of them are, there that they start reincarnating in together, which is why we have so many experiences of feeling like we've known somebody before, because we have a tendency to want to play in the same pool.
Yeah. As a psychic medium, do you have students and to teach them how to be a psychic medium and just like quickly, if I were to ask you like what would be the first thing you would want to teach someone who wants to learn about this? What would be the first thing you would tell them to do?
Okay, so yes, I do take students. I have a mentorship program that people can check out. It's on my website. And I also do spirit communication intensives. I will be doing some in the fall, probably November, just because I'm so busy. I haven't been able to get to them. But wintertime is usually when I do my online teaching. Um, and my first thing that I would tell people is that you have a body, you have more power. And the reason I'd say that is that we have been taught to be afraid of like spirit possession and, all of these dogmatic things. And in truth, there's a lot more good spirits out there than there are bad, just like there's a lot more good people out there than there are bad. But also, because this is our vessel, we own it. We have more power over it. It's like defending a castle. Defending a castle is a lot easier to do than attacking a castle. So, one of the things my grandmother used to say to me a lot when I was a kid was that fear is the soul eater or the soul killer. Okay. And the reason why is because when we enter with fear, then we give our power away in those situations. We are, excuse me, powerless because we believe we are powerless.
Exactly.
And I'm always, reminding people that spirit needs you in many ways more than you need them in this realm. Because as a medium, you can choose to allow a spirit to use your energy or not. And that's one of the things that we all need to kind of learn is our own power in it so that we don't have to be afraid, that we enter as equals instead of seeing that this is something in which, oh my goodness, this is, more powerful than me. No, it's not. It's just different. It's spirit.
So do you believe that spirits that some spirits need help?
Yes.
Okay, because you always hear, that when spirits cross over, it's like they shed all of the bad things. They shed, who they were. If they died of like their arm getting blown off, when you see them, they'll have their arm still. People who are disabled are no longer disabled, et cetera, et cetera. And so like they don't need our help. And I've always disagreed with that concept. And I was just curious to know how you feel
Yeah.
about that. Like, in what way do
So
we help?
when we die, we become all that we were, which means that we become aware of other lives that we've lived. We become much more complex. As far as whether, yes, when somebody dies, well, they don't have a physical body, so they're missing a arm. They don't have to be that way anymore, but they may still choose to look that way. So spirits will often do that because it's easier to recognize them. For example, my father had a glass eye. He lost his eye in Vietnam, and that is an identifier of him. So he's more likely to keep it as a spirit, because it doesn't mean he has to be blind. What it means is that people will be like, oh, it has a glass eye. Well, that's a really significant hit. If a medium can get something that's that, then you can go, yeah, they're talking to the real person because they can see this. This isn't something that people would randomly throw out.
Mm.
So spirits will keep those things to be identified, but they don't have to have the handicap that comes with it. It's the same thing with mental handicaps. When somebody dies, I often tell people that if your loved one died from addiction or mental illness, you almost have to think of them as two separate people. Because when you're communicating with the actual spirit, you will find that it's like them at their clearest, them
Mm.
when where their heart really was.
Yeah. And that's hard. That's like,
And you can still, they'll share the memories with you. Excuse me?
oh, I'm sorry, because you were breaking up, I was breaking up, so I didn't know where we were in that. But
Yeah.
that's hard for a lot of people to accept too. Like, I've had situations where someone passed from addiction. You're talking to them about this person, they're like, "You're not speaking that. They would never sound like that. Like, they sound too smart or too whatever, too." And I'm like, "Yeah, but."
Right.
you know.
Usually they can, though, connect in and feel like, they do remember that that was their loved one before things got bad.
Yeah.
And so spirit, going back to does spirit need help? Yeah, spirit does. And spirit helps us as well. We are in an ancestral pool. So if you were, came back from war broken and traumatized, and you developed addictions because you were coping with your wounds, and you became verbally abusive to your family. Okay. When you die and you are looking at yourself, that's going to be really hard to look at. And now
Mhm.
that pattern might get carried on. Your child who didn't go to war but had an abusive parent might develop addictions, might develop abusive behaviors, and so on. And then it gets to a point down the line where somebody says, "Not me. I'm
Yeah.
not going to do this, and I'm going to heal myself." And when we start healing ourselves, which a lot of us are actually doing that. So I'm imagining that most of your readers probably actually, or listeners, fall into that category.
For sure.
Because there's so many of us who are here. Oops, sorry, my camera just moved. There's so many of us who are um, working on healing ancestral wounds. So when we're working on that, we are actually also helping to heal our ancestor who created the wound, because that person has been watching and has a feeling of responsibility because they've been watching how their damage has just rolled down the river of their family.
Yes.
Okay. So when we have somebody we love who's crossed over, when we heal ourselves, we start to help to heal them.
Exactly.
And when we've had a spirit of a loved one who's passed from traumatic means, whether it's self induced or not, there's going to be healing that's needed.
Yeah. I always say to my students, when ancestral work functions on a non-linear timeline.
Yes.
Everyone just assumes that ancestral literally means timeline going back, but that's not the case. And so when you're doing these ancestral healings, you are both retroactively and proactively healing your generational line, both,
Yes.
front and
Yeah.
back. And once you kind of see it from that perspective, it's amazing how much more like personal responsibility you start to take for your own actions day to day, because now you understand the impact.
Right.
you know Wild.
Right. And it's also, like it's happening exactly when it's supposed to. Like there are so
Yes.
many of us who we can't look at it as a coincidence. This is needed. There's a saying like, when you know better, you do better. Some of our
Right.
ancestors didn't know better. They didn't understand mental health. They were afraid of even going to a therapist because it would make that, like the only time you go to a therapist is if you're crazy. And so don't go to a therapist. And they were also taught to be stoic and swallow their wounds until their wounds came out backwards and sideways. So we live in a time period where it's in many ways more easy to educate ourselves and to heal ourselves than ever before. There are healers everywhere. There are YouTube videos and podcasts and books.
There's almost like a universal sense of urgency.
There is. There really is. I've been saying for quite some time, so, I've been tracking psychic evolution for a very long time, since about 2011. I started seeing an uptick in the amount of people that I was seeing that were having psychic experiences.
Yeah.
And I believe it was tied into the solstice of 2012, the winter solstice, and the Mayan prophecy, and all of the, what really happened was the alignment of our solstice sun with the center of the galaxy, which was something that hadn't happened in 26,000 years. And, those 2011 people I thought of as more like the front runners. There's always the people, my sister and I have been doing this for years, and there's even people older than me that's been doing this. So you know what I mean? There's always the front runners, but the tick up was so substantial. And now it is, most people identify as being empathic, as being able to experience other people's emotions, okay? And people are having precognitive experiences, whether they're in dreams or because they got themselves an oracle deck, or because they just started noticing all those synchronicities and realizing that, that nothing is a coincidence. But that piece that we're evolving into is also one of the reasons why we have to kind of go back to some of these, educating ourselves about death, educating ourselves about spirit contact, because this is normal. This is stuff that has been, woven throughout time, throughout cultures. So many different cultures have similar ways in interacting with their dead and seeing it as normal to honor our ancestors, and that can be as simple as when you're making, chocolate chip cookies like you used to with your grandmother, that you tell your kids about your grandmother and how you used to do this and what she was like and all of those things. Because when we share those stories, we keep our dead alive. We keep them, part of our family.
Yes. And it's interesting because here in America, when we say let's normalize something, here comes big corporate coming around and normalization turns into capitalization, right? Everything, as long as it has a monetary thing, it is now normalized. But I think what you're really saying here is that it's more about tradition and culture. Even though America is filled with all these different kinds of people, there's one thing that we all have in common, is that we're all gonna fucking die. So we might as well get used to it, and we get used to those realms. Now there's something I'm interested in knowing. You as a psychic medium, when you interact with spirits, are you having them visit you, or are you going to the dead? Are you going to the
I can do both, but I do this, I literally see people back to back some days, and it's like a phone call for me. People sit down with me because most of my appointments are individual. Sometimes it's a family or something, but I do primarily in my regular work day, I do one-on-one sessions with people, half an hour, both in person or on Zoom. And first thing I ask them is, who are you looking for? Because I don't want to waste your time, with whatever, relatives that come in. That's great. But chances are, if you've made this appointment with me, there's someone you're looking for. And so I always open and close in a very ritualistic way, where we take a couple breaths together, we close our eyes, and I call in my doorman so that my space is protected and, intentionally welcoming. And then I ask for the person that they are looking for. And then also I might say, and whatever other spirits are here in need of communication with, whoever. And at the end, I also always intentionally thank them and ask them to leave
Right, right.
because that's really important. And that's super important for anybody who is starting to think about, themselves as a medium, is making sure to have good housekeeping, making sure to ask those spirits to leave when they're done. And sometimes the spirit doesn't actually like dissipate. They might wait and walk out with their family members. My telling them to leave means my session is done. You can't stay here. You got to go.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I ask. I can go looking for spirits. But in my workday, I think of it as a more efficient way, as it's kind of like putting out a call like, hey, are you there? And I have to say that 99% of the time, I can get the person that they are looking for.
Wow, that's awesome. That is
Yeah.
awesome. Before I ask you a fun, just off the cuff question, just a reminder, you guys, these two books are amazing. Make sure you pick them up. The links will be in the comments below. So here's a fun question. So most people who are interested in ghosts and in psychic mediumship and the dead and all that usually dip their toe in with paranormal investigations and
Yeah.
ghost hunting. How do you feel about ghost hunting? Have you ever tried that? What's your thing on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I am not interested. And the reason why is because I personally, and this isn't, me throwing, hate at anybody who does it, but for me, I was first taught spirit communication by my great grandmother. And so this has been a part of my life, my entire life. And it was always seen as a duty and a responsibility as much as a gift. And that with that, I always tell people my grandmother would haunt my ass if I was going and making money off spirits that were suffering.
Yeah.
She would be so mad at me and so disappointed at me. She'd be like, why didn't you help those spirits cross over, Sally, instead of, doing a tour so that people can have that experience? I do offer people experience to feel spirit, both by teaching, but also when I do spirit galleries, a lot of times I will point out where the spirit is, what they, basically what they look like, giving people an idea like, hey, you should look just to the left of the person. And these are kind of things that you might see. And the reason I do that in those settings is that a lot of my students will go to my galleries just to see what they can see,
Yeah.
because they're learning at the same time. But for me, I have experienced, like I have a very strong draw to the Civil War, and my mother's family is actually from Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia.
Oh, wow.
And so I've done a lot of land work around battlefields where I've gone and done healing work on the land, and I have communicated. But in that case, I really, again, think it's a time warp, because when I have communicated with spirits on or near battlefields, it is not the spirit is stuck there. I often feel like I'm the one who's between time, then that I'm showing up to them. And
Right.
I have had experiences where spirit has experienced me in their mind and thought that I was the ghost because I had moved
Into
back
their space.
into their space.
Woo!
Yeah.
Talk about wild.
Yeah, I oh boy. Yeah, you should I have a third book that most, like you got the two that came from inner traditions, but my first book was called Jump Girl: The Initiation and Art of a Spirit Speaker. And
Okay.
that was the memoir of my life growing up psychic. And I had a major opening when I was 30. Um, it was through North Atlantic Press, so I just changed publishing houses. But
Okay.
most people who are having spiritual openings, I tell them they should read my first book, because I talk about all the experiences I had growing up in a psychic family. And then I explain them because of my years of professional experience. So, like, this happened, and this is what this actually was. And what I find is that when my clients come to see me, they often will have the book with them, and it's, got underlined, it highlighted, it has pieces of paper stuck in it. And the things that they're highlighting are the things that they also have had for experiences and didn't know what it was.
Yes.
Okay. So this is something that we're going to experience more and more as we go forward. Part of it is because we're living in really troubled times, and we, need to kind of wake up. If we don't wake up, we're fucked.
It's fact.
And so our spirits are working very diligently, and so are nature spirits, which is, the path of elemental witchcraft was about working with spirits that aren't human and working with elemental beings and fey beings and magic that comes from our earth. And, I'm not the only person talking about these things. It's like the thing about podcasts is I've done a lot of podcasts in the last few months and talked to people all over the world, and they're bringing up the same subjects. They're bringing up subjects around spirit communication, the more people having psychic experiences, and they're also bringing up dimension shifting.
Yeah.
So, like, and I personally have had these experiences. I know many people who have, where that something changed and this is not where I was yesterday.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Or
It's
even 5 minutes ago, because usually when it happens, it's literally like, what was that? And that's not, and I think we're doing it because we're collecting the best of ourselves. We're collecting the tools that we need in order to be these really, 5-dimensional beings, which means that we have conscious connection to ourselves, to other people, to the world around us, and to the multiplicity of ourselves. So, like our past life selves, parallel life selves, and also the multiple ways that maybe we've been in this particular life.
Yeah, no, you called it, you nailed it, and you're right. It's something that's it's in the air. It's in the air, and the traumas that we've seen, the tough times that we're going through, the food that we're eating, the music and media that we're exposed to, the parenting styles that are shifting, children's distance from nature and more towards technology. All of these things factor in. And I think, like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, that at least majority of people identify as empathic. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because if we can at least start with, let's not be dicks to one another. How about that?
Right.
If we can start there and then move into that compassion and move into that understanding, move into that precognition, it's we're seeing it, and it's happening fast, like you said. And people like you are needed. Teachers, other spirit speakers, we're needed right now to help guide these individuals during this transition, because it's a big one. It's big, and it goes against, not against, but it really puts their religious beliefs right here. And some people are just not ready to be right here yet,
Well, I think it all depends. I try really hard to use words that don't alienate people, because, I grew my business living in a very rural area. Vermont is really small. And I grew my business word of mouth. I literally got a book contract because somebody came to my house for a reading that led to introducing me to a publisher. So I've had the back door the whole time. And because I've lived in this rural area, I've had to be really clear about who I am. And I've never hidden that I'm a witch. I've never hidden that I'm a psychic, but I also was on a school board for 9 years. And I'm a very big community builder. And one of the things that I try really hard to do is to use words that don't turn away my clients. And this is kind of like one of my probably most prized things I've been able to do in my life, is that when I wrote my first book, I knew that my clients would buy my book because it was my story. When I wrote my second book, I was unsure how it would go because I have really normal clients, lots of them. Okay. And I found that not only did they buy my book, even though it clearly said the word witchcraft on the front of it, but they were taking pictures of themselves in nature, holding it and posting it on social media. So we're talking about school teachers and nurses and, doctors and, truck drivers and whatever. It was like really everyday people. I mean, I still have my share of, magically inclined, but I just tell people it's not limited to that. And the big reason is because when we're speaking about these subjects, our goal should be to be inclusive and that God's God no matter what we call him. And that if I'm respectful of how you see that, you're going to be more respectful of how I see that. And, that's the thing. Death is something that does bring that into play for people.
Gives everyone a common ground.
More people will come for spirit communication than would come for a psychic reading. Not to say that I don't have lots of people who come for psychic readings, but it's more like there are people who would never think about going to a psychic to get a reading who may still go to a medium because they're in so much pain.
Yeah.
Okay? That they are desperate and they are going to put themselves out on a limb into something they never even really thought they would believe in before because their heart hurts. And so people who do work in spirit communication have to really become good at how they speak in their, ability to hold space. Because, like I had a woman last week who literally bawled the entire time because her husband only died 8 days before. And, I know that for myself, I wasn't ready to do spirit communication publicly until I was about 30. And the reason why was because I knew that even while I got a lot of emotions that came up when I did a reading, it was going to be nothing compared to what you had to be able or prepared to deal with as a spirit medium.
Yeah, especially on a much larger scale like that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And when you talk about like the world that we're living in, we are living in a time of exceptional death. We went through our suicide. We have 2023 has beat all ever, the most suicides ever in the United States. And in my little state of Vermont in August, we met our overdose per year number, which means we still have 5 months left that will be added to that number, that we have surpassed what was the number of overdoses last year. So this time of exceptional death that we're living in is going to require us to find peace with death and also to learn how to navigate that ourselves, because funeral homes can't keep up. That is the truth. This is happening now, that there is a shortage of, bodies are sometimes having to wait, especially because of everything we've been through with loss in our country, or in the world with the pandemic. We're actually dealing with, just like in other subjects, learning to be at peace with death is going to become something that is more of a necessity. I just get booted out.
Sorry about that.
Okay, I was like, did I just get booted out or did you get kicked out? It's like, oh no, she's talking about death too much. She's got to go. No. It's something that, I do have a connection with death doulas. I don't, I do take part in a class that is taught periodically through Stardust Meadows. They teach a 12-week citizen death care workshop online. And at the end of it, I come in and talk about it from the perspective of a spirit speaker. But because of that, because I have this real close relationship to death, it is obvious that we need to, we have to find different ways, because it is becoming something that we're going to see as a necessity, not as a luxury, to know how to take care of your dead.
Exactly. Oh, I love it. I love it. Salicrow, thank you so much for coming on my show. This conversation was needed, and honestly, it could go on a lot longer. It really could. We had a lot of people show up tonight to come see you. I want to give a huge shout out to Zelma, Steven, Lavetta, Russ, Amber, Rob, everyone who's out and who will see us on the replay. Thank you so much. Now, where can people find you? And, are you working on any new projects?
So I actually, you can find me at my website, which is salicrow.com, and that's SALICROW.com. And I am working on a book for empaths right now, but I'm also getting ready, because I have a center in Vermont, and I am also hosting a witches ball in October. So that's kind of like, it's in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, and it is like a ball, like, people are supposed to get dressed up fancy pants and stuff. So it's going to be a great time. But yeah, I am a person who has multiple projects going at all times. I just Monday, I've collaborated twice in a jewelry line with a jeweler named Alex Lozier. You can find her at alexlozier.com, and that's ALEXLOZIER. And Alex and I did a elemental witches or elemental magic jewelry line last year, and the Betwixt and Between jewelry line comes out on Monday. So the cool thing about that is that all the stones were picked for their ability to help open a person up for communication, and for stepping into that world, whether it be through divination, scrying, or spirit communication. So yes, I have lots of projects, but you can find all that stuff by just going to my website.
Awesome. And you heard it, www.salicrow.com. Now, Salicrow, are there any last wise words of wisdom you'd like to leave the audience, whether it's developing, budding mediums, or people who might be needing some help during this time of losing a loved one?
Yeah. I tell people that one of the things that everybody should do is create an ancestor altar. And you can do this for a specific person who's passed, or you can do it for all of your ancestors. But having a space that you can go to regularly to connect will make that contact easier. And we used to use gravestones for that, but most of us don't live near the cemeteries that are dead or buried in anymore. And we need something that's a little more practical. That internal space that you can have in your home can be a shelf, it can be the top of a dresser, but it gives you a space to connect sacredly with your beloved dead. And they can hear us better than we can hear them. They can see us better than we can see them. So they are listening, and just keep your heart open.
That's it. That is it. Thank you so much to everyone for showing up tonight. Make sure you stop by every Sunday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, for wonderful interviews. Make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. And most of all, remember, this is how we grow, guys. Have a good night.